And of course, the scientists have now proved it. I was just reading a scientific report 2 years ago that the music of the spheres,
and
every single electron in the world gives off a sound. And of course, these touch telephones now illustrate it to anybody that doesn't believe it.
The stars sing. Did you know that? They discovered that stars each have a different tone, and they're all in harmony. Every star is in harmony and sings
the psalmist, you know, we used to think that was just beautiful, poetic, you know, the morning stars sang together. And now we're finding out they really do sing.
I'm sure they heard them sing back in the early days before the apostasy set in and so forth. That's the way God... Do you know who named all the stars? It was Adam.
Called them by name.
The scientists can't do it now. But it says in here, he named every last star. Billions. Because he could do it in a split second. Well, so much happened up there. I smelled a perfume. Now, Jan will remember an experience when we did this on the same program. I smelled a fantastic perfume that outranks any Chanel No. 5. It's indescribable, and I said, Jesus, I smell a perfume. Where does it come from? He said, didn't you read my book? And I said, what now, Jesus?
It's in the book.
It's in the book. It's called a sweet-smelling savor. And we're told that it's the prayers of the saints plus the very Jesus himself. He's called the sweet-smelling savor of God in one place. And in another place, Revelation 8:4 and 4:6, I think it is, the sweet-smelling savor of the saints arises as a prayer to the nostrils of God, see? And I smelled it. And just to think that God loves you and me so much that he'll take our poorly worded, sometimes totally inaccurate prayers, put them through his chemistry and come up with a sweet-smelling savor, and then he puts it in a golden vial, it says, and saves it for you and me to share with him.
Do you know what else is a sweet-smelling sacrifice or savor unto God? This will blow a lot of people's mind. You can read it in Philippians 4:18 and 19. Our gifts to keep the kingdom of God going. Says, and he's talking about it, he says, but though I appreciate your gifts, this is Paul talking, what makes me the happiest is the well-earned reward you will have in heaven because of your giving. And then look down in 19, it says, at the moment I have all I need, more than I need. I am generously supplied with gifts you sent me, and they are sweet-smelling sacrifices that pleases God well. When we give to keep a ministry going, that is part of that perfume.
You smelled some of that too.
You smelled some little grandmas giving.
Now, 3 times since we came back to earth, I've smelled that exact perfume. One was with you folks in the Shrine Auditorium. You remember that when you were on the platform?
Yes,
I was in the next to the last row. There was a heathen sitting next to me. He was just boiling at everything. I turned to him and I said, sir, do you smell perfume? Yeah, he says, I never smelled that kind before.
Even
he was allowed to smell it.
On the platform we were smelling it. Everybody was smelling it.
The Spirit of God came in and he was just blessing the group there with a manifestation that he can do a chemistry experiment anytime he wants.
That was a Good Friday. Do you remember? A Good Friday rally at the Shrine. Everybody smelled it. It was unbelievable.
I thought, of course, being in eternity, I was there forever. The ecstasy is impossible. I looked at my body. It was transparent. It was internally illuminated. It had no organs. Quickly, I asked Jesus, I said, how come people don't die in heaven? Because your book says nobody dies.
It's in the book.
I quoted him first there. So
it's in the book.
I said, it's in the book. He said, yes, my son. It's also in the book that you are made like angels when you're in heaven, and therefore you have no organs, and only organs can die.
Boy, that's true.
Now this, of course, he was talking to a doctor, see? It was about that time that he showed me that I was a neuter. I told this story, and I think it's very appropriate.
There is
because
no sexual...
no need, see?
Yeah.
And I said, Jesus, you made me a man, but I'm a neuter now. See? And
You
I
gave yourself a physical
Yeah,
examination
sure,
right
I
there.
did. Head to toe as best I could. And he said, my son, I told you in the book that I only ask man to replenish the earth, not heaven. Up here, everything was either created or recreated. Reborn, in other words.
Reborn.
See?
Yes, yes.
So I've had many people just so worried that their husbands or their wives have died and gone on ahead, and they may get mixed up with somebody up there. you know, people think of all things, and they come up with tears sometimes. I've had them in prayer lines. Do you think my husband is remaining true to me in heaven?
Oh, really? You actually get
Yeah.
questions like that?
You know, after all, I haven't read the book. See? And I said, well, they will be as the angels are in the respect that they're not married nor given in marriage, nor do they have to reproduce up there, and therefore they have no relationship to you anymore.
Do you have any clue, Doctor, as to whether or not there will be a special relationship, say, with a husband and wife in heaven that have been husband and wife here on earth? Or does that get all
My
done away
personal
with?
feeling, and that's one question I didn't ask the Lord, but I went back to the book, and the agape love, which typifies the love of heaven, is on such a much higher plane than a reproductive erotic love that I'm sure that our relationship will be one of total ecstasy with all God's children. Now, we'll recognize our wife, or wives nowadays, see, or husbands. I'm sure of that. But if we are in heaven, the relationship is a marriage to Jesus. The Bible tells us clearly that it will be an agape love of his body to the head. The marriage of a bride to a bridegroom. And this kind of a love surpasses anything that physical cells could provide. Now that's my answer, and I think it's biblical. But I'm not going to say I'm quoting Jesus, because I didn't ask you.
Did you see anyone or recognize anyone in heaven?
No. And for a purpose. I was amazed that I was alone in this tremendously large paradise of botanical wonders. Just so beautiful that, well, you just have to use superlatives that don't exist, see? And yet I saw no one. And I said, Jesus, tell me, why am I all alone in this beautiful paradise? And he said, didn't you read the book? I said, no, what did I miss? He said, I promised my disciples that I would go to prepare a paradise for each of them. And he said, are you not aware that all of my promises in the Bible have to do with individuals? And he said, if you were the only one that I had saved, you would have a paradise. And besides that, then he went into a long story that would take 18 years as to how he gave every one of his children a distinctive group of talents, of gifts, of cells even. No two people can be alike, with the idea that while they were in their earthly life walking with him, hopefully, they would develop these to their maximum. But he said, because of sin, nobody develops those talents I give. So he said, I bring them up into their own paradise, which is that place that they would most have enjoyed, could they have picked it out for their individual desires and dreams. He said, I told you I'll give you the desires of your heart, and they should be a heavenly place.
I go to prepare a place for you.
Right.
And didn't you point out one time that even in John 14, where he says, in my Father's house are many mansions, that's an old English word. It really doesn't mean, you know, the Gone with the Wind mansion with the pillars in front, does it?
Actually, what it means, in the best Greek translation that I can find, is Jesus' reference to something they understood as he was talking, which was the temple. And the word mansions in King James is the word used for the cubicles. It's really the word cubicle that were in the temple along the sides, and each priest had his own cubicle, and each person that worked there of any rank had his own cubicle. And these cubicles, being in the temple of God there in Jerusalem, of course, were the finest thing that a person could aspire to. And so Jesus used them as illustrations. The other word, besides cubicles, is abode. Just a place of
Abode.
of spending time in the presence of God is really the
Okay.
kind of abode it is. See? Such as
And since you were a real botanist and flower lover, he gave you a botanical garden. didn't he?
precisely.
Yeah.
And of course, then he did the cute little thing. You know, Jesus is always full of little tricks. I presume that he was winking to his disciples every now and then as he talked to another one. See? And I had always disagreed with the possibility, as told in Revelation, that there could be liquid gold that you could see through. Streets of gold. I went to the chemistry, I went to the physics lab. There's no such thing. You heat it, you pound it, even when it's quintesimally thin, it's still solid. It's an impenetrable thing on earth, and yet it says you see through it. And Jesus knew that. What did he do? He had me land in a bed of white flowers that had golden centers, the calyces and the pistils and the stamens of liquid gold. And instantly, as I looked down at this bed of flowers, I was looking longitudinally through the stamens, right down to the stem, through liquid gold stamen. And I heard myself say, and of course he was doing, "Thank you, Jesus. Now I know anything's possible." Well, that's just a little sidelight.
Did you pick any of the flowers?
I did pick them, and this was what was so interesting. The one thing I did remember about Earth was that I'd been married to a lovely lady. And I decided that the two of us being one must have had a common tragedy or something. I didn't know how I got there. I didn't remember Earth. She must be there in the other end of a paradise. So I thought, I'll pick her a nice bouquet of these golden-centered flowers. And then I looked at my hand, and the thing was already picked and in my hand. That's when I exploded to Jesus, and I said, "Tell me about this. All I do is think something, and there it is." And he said, "Didn't you read my book?" He said, "That's how I characterized my mind. Whenever I think something, it becomes an act or a fact."
Now, where is that in the book?
Well, that's all through the book when you start looking at it. It is that God formed the earth, it says, with his word. Now, the word is not a spoken word as we know it, because that takes air to carry it. His is a thought word, but it's still a word. So all he had to do was to think a word. Star, moon, sun. Think a word. Be there, be there, be there. Whatever he did. See? Think a mud pie that'll be like a man. Think a living soul. And he said, "My son, as soon as I have any thought at all, it is either an act or a fact." And he said, "You just experienced that." And then, of course, the most wonderful thing was that here I'm holding this fantastic bouquet of flowers, and I suddenly realized the stems are bone dry, as we would know them on Earth. And of course, I'd held thousands of stems. You have too, and you can feel the moisture. And I said, "Jesus, these stems are bone dry. Explain to me why there's no water as I know it." He said, "Didn't you read the book?" He said, "I formed the H2O," and that's the way he used it, the hydrogen-oxygen molecule that we call water. I formed the H2O as a substitute for what we have in heaven. And he said, "Here we have the living water." And he said, "Everything is nourished with my living water."
Glory.
Isn't that great?
Oh, I love it. Oh, how long were you in heaven, Dr. Reedy?
course, we
Having come back, you were dead how long?
Well, it was at least 2.5 hours before any strange sign of life showed up on the oscilloscope, and then it was not human heartbeats. They didn't know what they were. They were blips. It was approximately, let's say, from 11 a.m. to 6 the next morning, around the clock, until I was put back in this body with my own mind. And that, of course, is another long story. But it was long enough that they decided to request the autopsy in the admitting room where the body had been taken, in hopes of finding how come the body had suddenly died. It had no blood. It was obviously a corpse, but what could kill it that fast that it hit the cement and it was dead by the time that the paramedics could get there, and they were just around the corner.
Do you still correspond with or keep in touch with the doctor who attended you there?
Well, that's another story. The doctor that attended me, apparently in perfect health, suddenly died 8 weeks later and had refused to believe my story. Another doctor that was involved, we haven't been able to find where he is. The whole thing, the answer is no. I wrote for the records, and they had destroyed them. The explanation being that there was no way they could write them, and they didn't want to be bothered. So I don't have that verification, but that's human verification.
Yes.
The first thing I heard when I landed in paradise was what you already referred to out of the book, Dick, you're dead. Now, this was the voice of Jesus on my ears, obviously, as I was to learn instantly, testifying that I was dead in the sense that Earth would call it, see? Because I didn't feel dead. I was more alive than can be described.
They actually then finally decided to sew your head up and...
Yeah, they couldn't get permission to do the autopsy because I was a Californian that might sue them, was their explanation. And so they sewed the pieces of scalp back over.
I can see the scars.
Yeah, there's just a few left now.
If Matt can get close enough, you can still see all the scars.
And then the next morning when Maybelle came in to sign the corpse to go to the parlor as they requested over the phone, she noticed that all of the sutures were healed. Not the sutures, the tears were healed, even though it was still a corpse. And that's when she realized that God was healing a corpse just to prove that he can heal anything.
Oh, wow. When did you understand that your visit to heaven was over, and what was the experience like to come back then and enter your physical body?
Initially, it was total hell. Now, this is the miracle, and probably one that won't be understood by many of the people that are listening, but listen closely now. The first sensation I had, and I don't know how many hours later, from 4 to 10 later probably, was the greatest agony that can be only imagined. It was so much worse than our human sensory system can stand that we'd go into shock long before that. And the interesting thing was that I was not feeling it with my mind. I knew later, but not at the moment. I could distinguish as individual cells every cell in my body. And every cell was screaming in torment. From my toes, my fingers, my hands, my belly, everything. Total agony, total screaming. And it only lasted about 2 seconds, perhaps. And when it went, I then said, Jesus. Now I had my mind again, or the mind of Christ again. I was, to learn later, I was lying in bed, a corpse, waiting to be disposed of somewhere. And he came back, put his mind back, and for 2 minutes, or for 2 seconds, gave me that unbelievable. And I said, quickly, Jesus, why? Why did you hurt me like that? And he said, my son, did you read the book? He said, I told you in the book that I was slain from the foundation, before the foundation of the earth, to bear everyone's iniquities and agonies and pain and sorrow. And he said, I just wanted to give you a little idea of what it meant. And he said, further in my book, I told you that my body of believers is like the body we created out of clay, in that it consists of cells that touch one another. And he said, there's billions of cells in my body. And he said, every one of those cells has had pain, which I bore on the cross. And he said, you have now experienced for this little bit, because I knew you couldn't any longer, what it means to be totally aware, as I am, of every individual cell in my body and how it's hurting and when it's hurting and where it's hurting. And then later he was to go tell me, go tell them that I died for them, whether they know it or not.
How soon after you came back from heaven were you well and able to be up and around? God healed you then, didn't he?
It wasn't the overnight miracle. He healed me to the point that it's after 6 the next morning, having gone in 11 the previous morning, then 6 the next morning, I became conscious with a brain of my own, which only works at the speed of very slow, see? And I was able to detect that I had been in a bad accident because it was obvious. He left enough then that I would know that anything that ever happened after that was his power and not mine. So it would have been what, from 11, 6, 7, 18 hours. And then, of course, it was a matter of several weeks before I was strong enough to get over the initial of trauma. Everything in my body was pretty well damaged in some way. But that first hour, the Lord came into my room while I'm a corpse, gave me again for a moment the spirit mind, which has spirit eyes. Now, these spirit eyes are something that are talked about. They see everything, any distance, anywhere, front, back, side, up, and down. It's the eternal eye of God. And I had been given that eye, and instantly I was looking at the corpse. It had my face, a rather disturbing thing. I had no blood, was lying there totally as a corpse, inert. And it was then that he spoke. I didn't see him. And he said, "My son, I just returned in order to give you the answer to my promise that I gave you during the night, that with your hands you will heal, and my peace I will give unto you." And then we had an anatomy lesson and began. I was telling him where I thought I'd start and how to do it. Of course, we had a lot of fun. You know, Jesus is a fun person. If we just treat him as though he was living next door, he's a neighbor.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
Oh, amen.
Best friend.
We put him on such a pedestal, which he belongs, the pedestal is his. But he steps down off the pedestal to the lowest child. He steps down to anybody that's a drunk, to anybody that's a professor. He doesn't care. For him, it's stepping down to any level of our society to come and talk to us. See?
Doctor, what's the bottom line? Why did Jesus let you have this experience?
I've asked him many times, and there's no question that he gave me the answer 5 years later when you and I were over in Israel. And then's when he took me into Lazarus' tomb. And for 2 minutes, the light went out. For 2 minutes, the people with me were gone.
Hold it right there. Don't miss the second part of this fascinating story and testimony. The answer will come as Dr. Eby shares this second great experience that he had over in the land of Israel. Actually with Jan and me and a whole group of TBN partners who were visiting over there in a deep little dark dungeon known as Lazarus' tomb. We'll go there in just a minute, okay? And if you have prayer needs, phone them in right now. Many of you are calling. Some are even calling, aren't they, honey, to receive Christ. And we're going to agree with you. Jesus, hey, if he can bring a Dr. Eby back from the dead and restore him, if he can bring a Lazarus who's been dead 4 days back from the grave, your little problem is nothing for God. He can do anything, and he wants to. That's the good news we want to share with you tonight. Get ready. We're going to pray with you, and we're going to agree with you for your needs right now. This will be I want to urge those of you who have never really committed your life fully to Jesus Christ to give us your undivided attention now for the next, Dr. Eby, we've got maybe 10, 12 minutes before the break. And I want you to just tell us what God let you see. He completed the experience by showing you the other side, didn't he? Heaven is beautiful, but hell is also very real, isn't it?
You can imagine my lack of peace for the next 5 years when the Lord shut everybody's ears and mouths and mine telling about this experience until finally you invited me on this very station. And that was our first exposure. But I got no answer from the Lord for those 5 years of prayer as to why he had sent me back, and I wasn't being given an opportunity to tell about the fantastic reality of heaven and his love, the fact that we're in him. And then in Lazarus' tomb that day, totally unexpected, the light went out. There I am standing 2 stories underground, cannot see my hand in front of my face. 2 ladies next to me suddenly seem to be taken away. I suddenly feel, for a split second, absolutely alone. And then the tomb filled with the same Shekinah glory. It's golden at one minute, pure white at the next. It intermingles. And I knew that Jesus had to be there because he is the center of the Shekinah glory. At that moment, I'm dropping to my hands and knees with the previous intent of trying to find the hole out of the tomb. So I find myself on my hands and knees. When this light hits, quickly I look to the side of my hand, and there is the hem of a garment with 5 toes protruding. It was a golden hem. There was no doubt in my mind whose toes, whose hem, because at the same moment I again had the mind of Christ that he'd given me in paradise. And I said, Jesus, and I leaped to my feet and found myself standing tightly against an individual who had not been there before, with a firm body. This was no spirit body now. And he grabbed me around the shoulder. I looked up just as I'm doing now, indicating that his eyes were 4 to 5 inches higher than mine, so he stood 6 to 6'1". That's interesting to a doctor, you know, you summarize it. Yeah. He grabbed me around the arm, pulled me tight into himself until I thought he was going to bruise me. And it was to prove to me, I was to find later, and I'll summarize most of this now, that he wanted me to realize he was showing me that body, which he showed to other people for 40 days on earth, called a resurrection body. It does exist. I did feel it. I was pressed against it. It is unlike ours in that there's no gushiness, as I say. There is no water, no serum, no blood, nothing like you and I have that make it soft. It is firm. He is a man of steel. You know, he's ready for that horse and that sword. And when he swings it,
glory.
Glory, see? And I looked in his eyes, and there I saw love like laser beams. They cannot be described as blue eyes, brown eyes. They are sovereign eyes that have a color of eternal light, which is impossible to describe because we've never seen it. And he said, my son, I brought you here to tell you many things and to show you others. He said, I know your prayers for 5 years. I refused to let you go out and speak until I could show you hell. He said, my son, this is the last generation. I will return now before you even have a chance to finish the ministry that I'm now commissioning you to enjoy.